Mist drifts over the yellow plains of ancient China. From somewhere beyond the hills, a bronze drum echoes, slow and deep, like the heartbeat of an empire that has forgotten its rhythm. The sun rises through the haze, touching curved rooftops and flooded fields, yet beneath this calm, the world is coming apart. It is the spring and autumn period, an age of fractured kingdoms and restless hearts. More than 100 feudal states fight for power, each proclaiming virtue while hiding greed. Kings betray their allies, soldiers burn villages, peasants bow to survive. The world has lost its harmony, and no one remembers when it began to fade. Among these broken lands walks a man in coarse linen, carrying a scroll of bamboo slips bound by worn thread. He moves neither fast nor slow, his gaze steady upon the horizon. His name is Confucius. He was born in 551 BCE in the small state of Lu, to a family too poor to matter and too proud to surrender. His father, once a warrior, died when the boy was 3. His mother, a gentle and educated woman, raised him alone, teaching him that knowledge was light, and that light must be shared even in darkness. In the dim glow of an oil lamp, the child learned his first lesson, that goodness begins in the smallest acts. As a boy, Confucius rarely joined the other children in their games. He preferred to sit at the crossroads and watch. He studied how merchants argued, how neighbors quarreled, how they laughed a moment later as if anger were never real. He was not judging them. He was learning the secret patterns of human hearts. One evening, his mother asked, "What do you see in people, my son?" He answered, "They all want peace, mother, but none of them know what peace means." She smiled, for in that simple sentence she heard something she herself had not understood. Years passed. Confucius read ancient texts, learned rituals and music, memorized poems and laws, yet the more he learned, the more he saw how knowledge alone could not heal the world. He met scholars who spoke of virtue, yet bowed to power, officials who quoted morals while stealing from the poor. Even the wise seemed restless, chasing honor instead of harmony. He began to ask himself, what binds a society together when fear and greed tear it apart? The answer came not from the heavens, but from within. Harmony, the rhythm that aligns people with each other and with the universe itself. Without harmony, the mightiest empire would crumble like sand. But harmony was nowhere to be found. The rulers of Lu feasted while peasants starved. Neighboring states waged endless wars. The old songs of ritual had become hollow sounds for empty ceremonies. At night, from the outskirts of the city, Confucius watched the palace lights shimmer through smoke and thought, when the hearts of men grow cold, even the brightest lamps cannot chase away the dark. He felt sorrow, not anger, for he believed people were not born wicked, only lost. The way, he would later teach, is not far from us. It lives inside the heart, waiting to be remembered. One summer day, sitting beneath a large tree with a group of young pupils, Confucius said, "Look at the birds that fly, the fish that swim, the beasts that run. Each lives in harmony with its world. Should humanity not do the same?" A boy asked, "Master, what is harmony?" Confucius smiled. "It is when you understand that you are not the center of everything." In a time when everyone wanted to win, Confucius dared to teach the beauty of yielding. To him, the greatest victory was to master the self. Yet his ideas were mocked. Warlords saw kindness as weakness. Ministers called his doctrine naive. They said, "A king who is soft will be destroyed. A man who bends will be broken." Confucius answered softly, "The rigid tree snaps in the storm. The bamboo that bends survives." That sentence traveled farther than any sword could reach. It became a proverb carved into stone centuries later. Confucius was not a prophet living in temples, nor a nobleman hiding behind walls. He walked among common people, teaching through action. He joined peasants repairing roads, comforted widows, fed hungry travelers. When asked why a scholar would labor with rough hands, he said, "When a house is burning, do you ask who owns the water?" His philosophy was not about escaping the world, but redeeming it, one small kindness at a time. He began to see himself as a thread connecting what was lost, the forgotten virtues of loyalty, respect, and compassion. He believed harmony did not mean everyone must be the same. Instead, it was the blending of differences, like a melody where high and low notes create beauty together. If all instruments played one tone, he told his students, there would be no music at all. Harmony, then, was not silence. It was the balance of opposites, the art of listening, of yielding without losing one's core. During his early teachings, he quoted ancient texts, the Book of Songs, the Book of Rites, but he spoke of them as stories, not commandments. The man who truly learns, he said, is not the one who remembers many words, but the one who can make a child smile with kindness. Some of his listeners wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition, because they realized how far they had drifted from what they once knew to be right. To Confucius, the chaos of his age was a lesson. Humanity had lost its equilibrium. People knew how to kill, but not how to forgive, how to speak, but not how to listen, how to conquer, but not how to care. He would look at the sky and wonder, if heaven and earth move in harmony, why do men choose to fight against it? From that question grew his lifelong quest to restore the harmony between heaven, earth, and humankind. Harmony was not a goal to chase, but the natural state when one lives according to virtue, gentle like water, steady like the wind. And so, in the fading light of an afternoon, the image of Confucius stands upon a hill overlooking the city of Lu. The roofs below shimmer gold in the sunset. Smoke curls upward from the homes of farmers. The air carries the faint toll of a temple bell. He whispers to himself, "The world is not lacking in clever minds. It is lacking in kind hearts." A soft breeze rustles through the grass, scattering leaves at his feet. In that quiet moment, he understands that harmony is not an idea, but a living presence, a rhythm that breathes through every mountain, every river, every human soul. And so begins his journey, the long, humble pilgrimage to teach humanity how to live once more in tune with the world. The rain had come to Lu, soft, persistent rain, the kind that blurred the mountains and silenced the fields. The roads turned to mud and the markets emptied. In a small house with a leaking roof, a young Confucius sat by a flickering oil lamp, copying ancient verses onto bamboo slips. The ink bled slightly with each drop that fell through the cracks above him, but he didn't mind. For him, learning was a form of prayer. He believed that every word the ancients had written was a fragment of a greater harmony, a song the world had forgotten how to sing. His mother would sometimes find him still awake when dawn came. "Rest, my son," she would whisper. He would smile faintly. "Mother, the world outside never sleeps. How can I?" Confucius's youth was marked by absence. A father lost too soon, a home too quiet, and a land too uncertain. But in those silences, something stirred. A hunger not for wealth or power, but for meaning. He worked as a lowly clerk, measuring grain and tending livestock for the state. The pay was small, but the lessons were vast. From farmers, he learned patience. From merchants, he learned fairness. From children, he learned honesty. And from the corrupt, he learned what destroys harmony fastest: greed disguised as wisdom. He began to realize that the greatest teachers were not found at palaces or libraries, but in the faces of ordinary people. The wise man, he wrote later, learns from everything he sees. When Confucius turned 20, his mother died. He buried her with his own hands on a hillside outside Lu. For 3 years, he lived near her grave, in mourning. It was there, under the shade of old pines, that the seeds of his philosophy began to bloom. He observed how the seasons changed, the trees shedding, the rivers shrinking, then swelling again. Life and death were not enemies, he thought. They were partners in an endless cycle. If nature could find harmony between loss and renewal, then so could man. He wrote in his notes, "To honor the dead is to understand the living. To grieve is to remember what connects us all." The villagers called him strange, but those who met him felt something unshakable in his calm, like a lake reflecting both storm and sky without losing its stillness. When his mourning ended, Confucius left the mountain and began to teach. Not formally. He had no school, no temple, no followers yet. He simply walked from the village to village, speaking with farmers at dusk, listening to travelers at inns, questioning the world as if it were a classroom without walls. Why? He would ask. Does a ruler demand loyalty if he gives none? Why do people fear truth more than war? And often, he would say nothing at all, simply watching how people lived, noting their joys and contradictions. He was not preaching, he was learning how to see. One evening, he stopped at a roadside shrine. The place was deserted. The candles melted down to pools of wax. He lit a new wick and bowed 3 times, not to any god in particular, but to the spirit of the age itself. "I do not seek favor from heaven," he whispered. "I seek to understand why men have forgotten its rhythm." That night, as the wind rose, Confucius realized something. The way, the Tao, could not be found in a temple or written on a scroll. It had to be lived. And harmony was not a theory. It was a practice. In words, in gestures, in how one faced suffering without bitterness. From that night on, he no longer saw himself as a scholar, but as a seeker. One who walks not to arrive, but to understand. The state of Lu, however, was no place for dreamers. Power shifted constantly between rival clans. Ministers plotted in the dark while commoners whispered in fear. Confucius watched all this unfold like a spectator at a tragedy he could not leave. He saw how the desire for control turned even wise men cruel. He once remarked, "To rule without virtue is to light a fire and call it the sun." Still, he believed the flame of virtue could be rekindled if men learned to govern themselves before governing others. He began teaching the young sons of noble families, insisting that ritual without sincerity is emptiness. Many resisted his gentle authority, but some stayed, drawn by his strange combination of humility and conviction. They would later call themselves his disciples, though he never called them followers. He called them friends on the road. One morning, as mist coiled around the city walls, Confucius took them to a stream. He pointed to the water and said, "Do you see how it moves? It never stops. It bends around stone, flows under bridges, yet never loses itself." "Master," one asked, "why are you showing us water?" Confucius smiled, "Because that is what harmony looks like. Strength in motion, peace and persistence." He threw a pebble into the stream. Ripples spread outward, touching every leaf and reflection. "So too," he said, "does one act of goodness reach farther than we see." The students were silent. In that silence, the way became visible, not in words, but in feeling. Over the years, his circle grew. Some came out of curiosity, others out of despair. They expected a prophet. They found a man who listened. Confucius never claimed to possess divine truth. Instead, he said, "I am not an inventor of wisdom. I am its messenger." When they asked him what he sought, he replied, "To teach men how to live without fighting their own hearts." To him, that was the truest revolution, not overthrowing kings, but transforming the spirit of man. But harmony, he knew, would always be fragile. One night, while traveling through a war-torn region, he witnessed soldiers burning a village. Women screamed, children fled into the woods. Confucius tried to intervene, but was pushed aside. When the flames died, he sat in the ashes, holding a small toy he had found among the ruins. He whispered, "This is what happens when power forgets compassion." He did not cry. Instead, he began to sing, a soft melody from the Book of Songs, one that spoke of returning home. The soldiers who heard it paused. For a brief moment, they were children again. That night became legend, the night the sage sang to silence violence. From that day, his purpose deepened. He began to see his mission not as teaching philosophy, but as healing memory, and reminding people of a truth they once knew before the world hardened them. He said, "A man who conquers himself has no enemies left." And his disciples wrote his words on bamboo, carrying them across the states like seeds scattered by wind. Years passed. Confucius aged, but his fire did not fade. He was still poor, still traveling, still questioning. He had been offered position at court. He refused most, knowing politics without morality was poison. When one duke asked why he wouldn't serve, Confucius replied, "Because your throne stands on trembling hearts." He preferred walking dusty roads to sitting on golden chairs. There is a story that, during a long journey, Confucius once stopped to rest beneath a plum tree. A storm was coming. His disciples urged him to seek shelter, but he stood and watched the wind tear at the branches. When it passed, he said softly, "Even in chaos, the roots remain." He looked at them and added, "Be the root, not the storm." They did not fully understand then, but centuries later, those words would define the very soul of Eastern philosophy. By his 40s, Confucius was no longer just a scholar of Lue. He had become a living symbol of hope. People began to whisper, "The sage walks among us." Yet to himself, he was still a learner. Each dawn, he bowed to the rising sun and said, "Heaven, let me grow gentle before I grow old." He carried within him both grief and serenity. Grief for the suffering of man, serenity for knowing that even suffering had its place in the great harmony. The birth of a seeker. It was never about his birth in blood, but his awakening in spirit. In a world that sought noise, he chose silence. In an age of weapons, he carried only words. And in a time of endless questions, he answered with one truth. Peace begins when understanding replaces judgment. That was the seed from which all of Confucius's teachings would later grow. Ren, benevolence. Li, ritual. Yi, righteousness. All branches from the same root. Harmony. The years passed like drifting clouds across the valleys of Lu. Confucius had walked many roads, and every mile carried a whisper of the past. When he looked at the mountains, he saw not only rock and soil, but memory. The slow patience of time. To him, the ancients were not ghosts of history. They were echoes still breathing through the earth. Each morning, before the sun rose, he would unroll a bamboo scroll and read by lamplight. The Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the old texts of Zhou civilization. Their words were faded, their meanings forgotten by most. Yet to Confucius, they were not relics. They were living conversations. The ancients spoke in symbols, he once told his pupils, but symbols are not cages, they are doors. When you open them, you do not find rules, you find reflections of your own heart. At that time, the state of Lu was small, hemmed in by larger kingdoms. Its rulers spoke of virtue, but practiced suspicion. Still, there were elders who remembered the old harmony, the age when music and governance shared the same rhythm. Confucius sought them out, traveling by foot from town to town, carrying nothing but a bundle of scrolls and an endless curiosity. In a remote village, he met an aged musician who once served in the royal court of Zhou. The man's zither was cracked. The strings had lost their shine. Yet when he played, the sound was pure, trembling like water on stone. Confucius listened, eyes closed. When the melody ended, he said softly, "Your music has no words, yet I hear virtue in it." The old man smiled. Virtue cannot be taught by speech. It must be felt, like rhythm. From that night, Confucius began to see music as moral geometry, the proof that harmony could exist in form, sound, and soul. He wrote later, "To govern a state is to tune an instrument. When one string is too tight, it breaks. When too loose, it falters. The master seeks the middle tone." When the harvest season ended, he visited the archives of Lu, a dim hall filled with dust and silence. There he studied the decrees of past kings, the ceremonies of ancestors, the chronicles of triumph and loss. He noticed how every age repeated the same pattern: order born from chaos, and chaos returning when pride replaced humility. "History," he murmured, "is not a river flowing forward. It is a wheel that turns until men learn." He copied entire passages by hand, not from memory, but for meditation. Each stroke of ink became a conversation with those who had long vanished. He began to realize that learning was not collecting, but communing. A dialogue between living and dead, between past and present. His disciples often asked why he obsessed over the ancients when the present burned with injustice. Confucius answered, "Because those who forget their roots grow crooked." He reminded them that the ancients were not perfect, but they had direction. They built civilizations not on conquest, but on harmony between heaven, earth, and man. To learn from them, he said, is to remember that virtue once ruled before violence did. He believed that wisdom did not age, it merely waited to be reheard. One night, as wind shook the temple doors, Confucius stayed awake copying a verse from the Book of Rites. "When the ruler is righteous, the people are tranquil. When the people are tranquil, the world is at peace." He paused, listening to the wind as if it carried the sigh of those who first wrote it. He thought about how far his own age had strayed. The scroll trembled in his hands, not from cold, but from understanding. Harmony, he realized, was not nostalgia, it was responsibility. Each generation inherited the rhythm of the last and had the duty to keep it alive. The next morning, he gathered his pupils beneath a tree. The air smelled of rain and earth. He told them stories, not of heroes, but of rulers who ruled with restraint, of sages who listened before they spoke. He spoke of King Wen of Zhou, who conquered not by arms, but by benevolence, of Duke of Zhou, who served his nephew as a guardian instead of seizing the throne. These men were not flawless, Confucius said, but they understood something our age has forgotten, that true strength is self-control, and true wisdom is patience. He looked at his students, young, eager, uncertain, and smiled. If we can remember even 1/10 of their humility, we may yet remember how to live. Over the following years, Confucius began shaping his own method of teaching. He never lectured, he conversed. When a pupil asked him a question, he often replied with another. "Master," one asked, "what makes a man noble?" Confucius replied, "What do you think?" The student hesitated. "Someone who never does wrong." Confucius shook his head gently. "No, someone who, when he does wrong, learns." This became his creed, learning as transformation. Knowledge without change was vanity. Change without reflection was blindness. Sometimes he walked alone into the countryside, reciting poems from the Book of Songs. Farmers would hear his voice rising over the fields, steady and calm. They said the sage spoke to ghosts. In truth, he was speaking to time. To him, poetry was not escape. It was the bridge between emotion and ethics. In its rhythm, he felt the pulse of humanity. He once told his disciples, "A man who cannot feel beauty cannot understand goodness." The ancients wrote poems not to decorate speech, but to train the heart to be gentle. Thus, learning from the ancients meant more than memorizing. It meant reawakening the senses that civilization had dulled. But not everyone approved. At court, the ministers of Lu mocked him. They said, "He digs up the bones of the dead while the living starve." Confucius replied calmly, "If the living remembered the dead, they would not starve." His defiance was quiet, but it frightened those in power, for they sensed his ideas might outlast their thrones. Still, he did not seek rebellion. He sought restoration. He dreamed of a world where leaders read before they ruled, where ceremony was not a mask, but a mirror of sincerity. One evening, as the sun set blood red over the fields, Confucius stood with his students by the river. The water glowed like molten bronze. He said, "I have read 1,000 pages, yet the river teaches more. It flows without pride, nourishes without demand, and moves onward without regret." He turned to them and asked, "What does the river remind you of?" One answered, "Of time." Another said, "Of destiny." Confucius smiled faintly. "Of harmony," he said, "for the river does not argue with the mountain, it finds its path around it." That became one of his most enduring metaphors. Harmony is not conquest, but coexistence. Later, when he compiled his teachings, he wrote, "The ancients studied to improve themselves. Men today study to impress others." He feared that knowledge had become decoration, an adornment for vanity rather than a tool for virtue. To counter this, he introduced 3 disciplines: reflection, to examine oneself each day; ritual, to remind the body of respect; music, to restore balance to the spirit. Together, they formed the foundation of what he would later call Li, the art of living in tune with the world. There is a story from this period. One evening, after a long day of teaching, a student named Yan Hui found his master staring at a candle. "Master," he asked, "what are you thinking?" Confucius replied, "This flame, it does not boast of its light, yet it dispels darkness. So should a man of virtue live." He blew out the candle and sat in silence, content with the lesson that required no words. Confucius's reputation began to spread beyond Lu. Scholars from other states came to test his wisdom, warriors to debate him, and peasants to seek advice. He welcomed them all, saying, "From 3 people walking together, I always find one teacher." To him, every encounter was education. Even fools taught him patience. Even enemies taught him restraint. He recorded nothing for glory. He taught because teaching was how harmony moved through him. Like wind through bamboo, wisdom needed no ownership. In time, his disciples began compiling his sayings. They called the collection Lun Yu, the Analects. But Confucius laughed when he first heard of it. "Do not build monuments to me," he said. "Build bridges to each other." He wanted his words to breathe, not fossilize. He warned them, "If you quote me without understanding me, you will turn music into noise." To learn from the ancients, he insisted, was to keep their voices alive, not trapped in ink. The year was drawing to its end. The wind over Lu had grown sharp, carrying dust from distant wars. From his small study, Confucius could hear the noise of soldiers training in the courtyard below. Iron against iron, the rhythm of fear disguised as discipline. He closed his scroll and whispered, almost to himself, "They learn to strike, but not to listen." He looked out toward the hills, where smoke rose from another battle. For months he had wandered among the courts of princes, offering counsel none wished to hear. Everywhere he went, he found the same disease. Rulers obsessed with order, yet ignorant of balance. They thought peace could be forced, like a nail driven into wood. Confucius had seen enough blood to understand that violence creates silence, not harmony. He began to speak of he, harmony, as the highest law of existence. Not a peace born of fear, nor the quiet of obedience, but a living equilibrium. Heaven above, earth below, humanity between, each tuned to the same unseen chord. When a man's heart is calm, he said, the family is at rest. When families are at rest, the state stands firm. When the state stands firm, heaven smiles. To him, harmony was not luxury. It was the architecture of survival. One dawn, his disciples found him sitting beside a pond, tossing pebbles across the surface. The ripples crossed and blended, forming patterns that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Master, Zulu asked, why do you study water so often? Confucius replied, because water teaches what swords cannot. It yields, yet shapes mountains. It reflects, yet hides nothing. It moves, yet never loses itself. He paused, watching the circles merge. This is harmony, the strength of gentleness. Confucius began teaching that the way of harmony was built upon three movements of the heart. Compassion, Ren, the inner warmth that binds man to man. Without compassion, rules rot into cruelty. Respect, Li, the outward discipline that gives form to feeling. Without respect, compassion dissolves into chaos. Righteousness, Yi, the courage to choose what is right over what is easy. Without righteousness, both compassion and respect become masks. When these three moved together, society breathed in rhythm with heaven. When anyone was missing, the world fell out of tune. He told his followers, harmony is not the absence of difference. It is the music that differences make when they agree. But harmony was difficult to preach in a time of ambition. Warlords saw in his words a threat, a weapon that could not be wielded. They asked, if a man never fights, how does he win? Confucius answered, by not needing victory. They laughed, thinking him naive. Yet history would one day echo his laughter back to them. In his travels, Confucius often stopped at crossroads where refugees gathered. He would share food, listen to their stories, and recite lines from the Book of Songs. A woman once asked him through tears, Master, the world is cruel. Where is heaven's mercy? He knelt beside her and said, heaven's mercy lives in those who still ask that question. That was the heart of his teaching. That harmony begins not in the throne, but in the smallest gesture of empathy between strangers. One evening, as dust settled, he drew a circle in the sand. This, he said, is the world. He placed a pebble at its center. This is the heart. When the heart moves, the world ripples. If the heart is troubled, the ripples break. Therefore, before seeking to govern others, govern the circle within. His disciples bowed, sensing the simplicity of a truth that could save kingdoms. Confucius's words soon spread like wind through bamboo, whispered by merchants, repeated by scholars, sung by children in streets. Some understood, others merely admired the sound of wisdom without grasping its weight. He warned them, words are leaves, meaning is the root. Do not collect the leaves and forget the tree. He feared that people would turn harmony into a slogan, not a practice. To him, virtue without inner work was like music without silence, noise pretending to be beauty. As his fame grew, so did the test to his faith. The Duke of Qi invited him to court, promising reforms. Confucius arrived hopeful. At first, the Duke listened, nodding as the sage spoke of compassion, justice, and restraint. But when Confucius proposed reducing taxes and freeing unjustly held prisoners, the hall fell silent. A minister whispered, your words would empty the treasury." Confucius bowed. "Then the treasury is full of chains." He was dismissed by nightfall. Walking home under a cold moon, he told his disciples, "Do not despair. Even rejection is a teacher. The world resists harmony because it fears losing its noise." The next months were hard. Confucius lived on rice and herbs, teaching in barns and roadside inns. Yet his spirit grew stronger. Poverty had become his purification. He said, "If one can remain kind while hungry, he has mastered the art of harmony." His laughter still came easily, his eyes bright even in exhaustion. He was poor, but never empty. One winter, while traveling through the borderlands, Confucius met a band of soldiers guarding a frozen bridge. Their commander, amused by the sight of an old scholar walking alone, asked mockingly, "What use is your wisdom against the sword?" Confucius answered, "The sword can cut the body. Wisdom can stop the hand that holds it." The commander, struck by the calm in his voice, ordered his men to let him pass. Long after Confucius was gone, the soldiers argued over his meaning. And that was enough. For debate is the first sign of awakening. In the years that followed, Confucius wrote that harmony is not uniformity. When the lute and drum play the same note, the song dies. When they differ and yet blend, beauty is born. To him, harmony was dynamic. A dialogue between difference and unity, between strength and softness, between heaven's order and man's freedom. He believed that the universe itself was built on such tension, day yielding to night, rain feeding the sunburnt earth, silence following thunder. If the cosmos could balance its opposites, so could humanity. He began organizing his thoughts into lessons, not for rulers, but for the ordinary person. Sweep your house before you advise the kingdom. Speak gently before you demand peace. Listen deeply before you command obedience. These were not decrees, but disciplines. He wanted every man and woman to become a small instrument of harmony, tuning themselves until society became an orchestra once more. At times, Confucius doubted whether his dream was too fragile for the world. Sitting alone beneath the stars, he confessed to Yan Hui, his most beloved student. "Perhaps the world is too loud for the song I carry." Yan Hui replied, "Then sing softly, master, so those who truly listen may hear." The old sage smiled, warmed by the truth that harmony does not need the crowd, it needs only the sincere. One spring, when peach blossoms filled the valleys, Confucius gathered his disciples and spoke for hours on the nature of balance. The strong must protect the gentle, the wise must guide the simple, the rich must uplift the poor. In such exchange, heaven finds its reflection. He compared society to the human body, each organ different, yet all sustained by the same blood. When one part suffers, all grow sick, he said. Therefore, heal each other. His words, though simple, carried the weight of prophecy. For centuries later, emperors would quote them to justify justice. But harmony, he taught, also required boundaries. Too much softness invites chaos. Too much hardness invites ruin. The river flows because its banks restrain it. He believed that rules were not prisons, but channels through which virtue could move. That was the paradox he loved most. Freedom made possible by restraint. The air above Lu was heavy with dust and ash. War drums beat beyond the northern hills, their echoes rolling like thunder across the plains. Villagers spoke in whispers now, and every night new smoke rose on the horizon. The world that Confucius had spent years studying was tearing itself apart. He had believed that learning from the ancients could mend the present, that the virtues of old might still guide the living. But as he walked through markets filled with beggars and soldiers, he began to wonder if wisdom alone could survive hunger and fear. "When the stomach is empty," he murmured, The heart forgets virtue. It was the spring and autumn age, a time when even the seasons seemed uncertain. States that once shared grain now shared spies. Princes feasted while peasants sold their children for bread. Temples crumbled, their bells silent under soot. And in the great halls of rulers, music had been replaced by the clatter of armor. Confucius saw it all with quiet despair. He was not angry. Anger would have been too easy. He was saddened by how far humanity had drifted from the rhythm of heaven. The stars still move in harmony, he said to his disciple Zilu, but men who walk beneath them have forgotten the pattern. When he served briefly in the court of Lu, he witnessed corruption firsthand. Petty officials sold justice to the highest bidder. Royal cousins schemed over land and concubines while the granaries emptied. Confucius tried to speak of moderation, of the duty of rulers to serve as fathers to their people, but his words fell like rain on stone. At a banquet one evening, he watched the Duke of Lu raise a golden cup while slaves knelt barefoot nearby. The Duke toasted, "To peace in our time." Confucius bowed slightly and answered, "Peace cannot be drunk. It must be planted." The hall went silent. He knew then that his time at court would be short. He left Lu with a handful of followers and wandered the borderlands. The roads were lined with refugees, families pushing carts of broken pots and faded memories. He gave away most of his food, saying, "What good is fullness when the world starves?" In every village, he listened more than he spoke. From a farmer beaten by tax collectors, he learned endurance. From a mother who buried her child, he learned grief. And from the silence of exhausted men, he learned that despair is the loudest cry of all. He began to see that the world's disorder was not born of ignorance, but of forgetting. Forgetting that power exists to serve, not to devour. One evening, after days without rest, he camped near a battlefield recently abandoned. The earth still smelled of blood and iron. He sat among shattered helmets and said to his disciples, "The ground remembers every footstep, but men forget every death." He picked up a rusted sword, examined the edge, and added, "Weapons are easy to forge. Wisdom is not." Then he placed the sword upright in the soil and bowed to it, not in reverence, but in mourning. To his followers, these travels felt aimless. "Master," they asked, "if the world refuses your teaching, why continue?" He smiled faintly. "Because the way is not a bargain. It must be walked whether others follow or not." In their eyes, he was a philosopher. In his own, merely a student of humanity's mistakes. He wrote at night by the light of fireflies, recording the contradictions he saw. Those who speak of peace prepare for war. Those who praise virtue fear the virtuous. Those who pray to heaven forget the earth beneath their feet. In a remote mountain village, he met a hermit who laughed when he heard the name Confucius. "The world is too noisy for harmony," the hermit said. "Why try to teach pigs to sing?" Confucius answered gently, "Because the song is not for the pigs. It is for those who listen in the distance." The hermit stared, then laughed again, softer this time. "You are mad," he said. Confucius bowed. So was every man who refused to give up on goodness. The wars grew closer. States devoured states. Kings vanished overnight. In one siege, Confucius and his companions were trapped for days with no food. His disciples despaired, but he continued to read aloud from the Book of Songs, his voice thin but steady. Zigong protested, "Master, how can you read poetry when we may die tomorrow?" Confucius replied, "Because if death silences our virtue, then the world wins twice." That night, when rain finally fell, his followers wept, not from hunger, but from the strange peace his words brought. Years later, people would say that Confucius survived because heaven protected him. But he knew the truth. He survived because he refused to stop believing that order was possible. Even as empires crumbled, he saw patterns hidden in the chaos, like constellations glimpsed between clouds. He began to realize that disorder itself was the teacher. Without the darkness of his age, he might never have understood what harmony truly meant. When the world is upright, he wrote, virtue is a habit. When the world is crooked, virtue must be a choice. One winter, he visited the ruins of an old temple destroyed by soldiers. Snow covered the broken statues. A child played nearby, shaping snow into tiny figures of men and horses. Confucius knelt beside him. "What are you building?" he asked. "A kingdom," the boy said, grinning. Confucius smiled. "And who will rule it?" The boy thought, then answered, "No one. Everyone will share." For a moment, the sage said nothing. Then he laughed, a deep, clear laugh that startled the crows from the trees. "Perhaps heaven still speaks," he whispered, "only through mouths too young to lie." He recorded that moment in his journal. Even amid ruin, the seed of harmony hides in innocence. It was then he began shaping his great principle, that goodness cannot be enforced, only inspired. That order built on fear collapses the moment fear fades. Real peace must grow from within, like roots unseen beneath the soil. He started to call this vision he, the word for harmony, balance, concord. To him, it was not mere agreement, but resonance, a moral vibration that could make hearts align as strings do in a well-tuned instrument. When he finally returned to Lu, the court was unchanged. The same quarrels, the same greed. But something within him had transformed. He was no longer frustrated, he was serene. He had seen the depth of chaos and no longer feared it. For he now understood. Harmony has meaning only in the presence of disorder. That night, he told his students, a wise man does not curse the storm, he learns to sail. He explained that heaven uses turmoil as its forge, shaping souls as fire shapes metal. The world, he said, is the anvil upon which virtue is hammered. His students sat in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside, the wind howled through the streets like a wounded beast, but inside, they felt a strange calm. Not long after, a messenger arrived from another state, offering Confucius a position as royal advisor. The ruler sought to restore harmony, or so he claimed. Confucius listened politely, then asked one question. Does your ruler wish for harmony or obedience? The messenger faltered. Are they not the same? Confucius smiled sadly. Only to those who have never heard real music. He declined the offer and returned to teaching, for he had learned that power cannot create harmony, only people can. Toward the end of the turbulent decade, a rare eclipse darkened the skies over Lu. People panicked, beating drums to scare away the dragon they believed was devouring the sun. Confucius watched quietly, then said to his disciples, "They do not understand that heaven's silence is not punishment. It is reflection." He saw in that moment a symbol. The eclipse was not the end of light, but its concealment, proof that even the brightest truths can be hidden, yet never destroyed. He wrote, "Harmony is the faith that the sun still shines behind the shadow." Dawn broke over the hills of Lu, pale and soft, like silk unfolding. The rain had stopped. The rivers that once raged through the valleys now moved gently, mirroring the sky. Confucius walked alone along the banks, his robe trailing in the damp grass. After years of wandering through war and hunger, he had come to understand the world's sickness, and now he sought its cure. He called that cure Ren. Ren, human-heartedness. To him, Ren was not charity, nor pity, nor mere kindness. It was something deeper, the pulse of heaven beating within the human chest. Ren, he said, is to love others as one would guard one's own life. It is to see in every face the reflection of one's own heart. Confucius believed that the decay of his age began when men forgot Ren, when kings ruled by fear instead of virtue, and when families valued wealth over warmth. Harmony dissolved like frost in the sun. Without Ren, ceremony became hollow, and law became cruelty. He told his disciples, without Ren, ritual is hypocrisy. Without Ren, justice is revenge. Without Ren, wisdom is arrogance. He paused, letting the silence settle. Ren is the thread that ties them all together. One afternoon, he sat beneath a willow tree with his students. The air smelled of wet earth. He said, "Imagine a man standing in a storm, clutching gold to his chest. He believes the gold will protect him, but it is the tree that shields him. So it is with Ren, unseen, uncounted, yet it saves the world." His disciples nodded, though few understood the full weight of his metaphor. So for Confucius, Ren was not about perfection. It was about connection, the invisible web that linked all hearts, from emperor to beggar, from father to son, from stranger to stranger. Once a disciple named Zigong asked, "Master, is there one word that can guide a man through life?" Confucius smiled. "Perhaps it is shus, reciprocity. Do not do to others what you would not wish done to yourself. That is the doorway to Ren." The phrase would echo through centuries, finding new names. The golden rule? Mutual respect. Universal empathy. But to Confucius, it was simple humility. The ability to step outside one's own desire and see the world through another's eyes. He often said that Ren was both root and fruit of virtue. It began in the heart, but blossomed in action. Words of goodness are wind, he warned, but deeds of goodness are rain. So he taught through example. He shared food with the poor, bowed to elders, and spoke gently even to those who mocked him. When one of his rivals insulted him publicly, Confucius merely smiled and replied, "If I return anger for anger, what difference lies between us?" To his disciples, that moment became a parable, the strength of gentleness. He once told a nobleman, "To govern a state without Ren is like playing music with broken strings." The nobleman frowned. Can compassion feed soldiers or defend borders? Confucius answered, "A hungry man can still fight, but a heart without Ren cannot even live." The nobleman had no reply. As his fame grew, Confucius's message spread beyond philosophy. Farmers quoted his words in fields. Mothers repeated them to children. Even bandits were said to spare travelers who claimed to follow the sage of Lu. But he never claimed ownership of virtue. "Ren does not belong to me," he said. "It belongs to all who remember that they belong to each other." At night, Confucius often gazed at the stars. He saw in their quiet order the reflection of Ren, every light distinct, yet none dimming the other. He believed the universe itself was compassionate, for it sustained life without asking for worship. "Heaven gives and asks nothing," he told his pupils. "So should the man of Ren." In those words, Ren became more than morality. It became cosmology, the principle by which heaven and humanity mirror one another. But compassion, he taught, was not weakness. To practice, Ren required courage greater than any sword. "The warrior conquers fear by force," he said, "but the man of Ren conquers it by understanding." He told the story of a ruler who once imprisoned a wise man unjustly. When freed, the man bowed to the ruler and thanked him for the lesson. "Why?" his friends asked in anger. He answered, "Because now I know the measure of patience." Confucius loved that story. To him, it was proof that Ren could turn suffering into wisdom. In his later years, he refined the teaching. To cultivate Ren, begin with one's family. If you cannot love those near, you cannot love the world. He urged children to honor parents. rulers to treat subjects as sons, and friends to be loyal in absence as in presence. To Confucius, society was an extension of the family, and Ren was the warmth that made the home a home. He said, "A nation without Ren is a house without fire. It may stand, but it cannot comfort." Still, the times tested him. Once while traveling, his group was surrounded by hostile soldiers. They demanded tribute. His disciples were afraid. Confucius stepped forward and said calmly, "We are not enemies. We carry no weapons, only words." The commander laughed. "Words cannot stop arrows." Confucius looked at him kindly, then let them fly. "But remember, words can stop the hand that draws the bow." The soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their bows. When the group finally passed safely, Zigong whispered, "Master, that was a miracle." Confucius replied, "No, my son. It was Ren, and Ren needs no miracles." He defined Ren not as sentiment, but as discipline, a lifelong cultivation of empathy until it becomes instinct. "The man of Ren," he said, "is slow to speak but quick to feel. He gives before asked, forgives before blamed. He sees dignity even in the fallen leaf." When Yan Hui asked, "How does one reach Ren?" Confucius answered, "By beginning where you stand. A single kind act, done sincerely, extends farther than 1,000 rituals." Over time, he began to speak of Ren as the center of all harmony. If harmony was the melody, Ren was the tone. Without it, music turned to noise and society to chaos. "Ren is the breath that gives sound to virtue," he wrote. "When it ceases, the world becomes silent." He compared it to fire, gentle enough to warm, powerful enough to transform. Handled with care, it gives life. Mishandled, it burns. Thus he taught moderation. Love guided by wisdom. In his 60th year, when gray streaks began to show in his hair, Confucius was asked if he still believed humanity could change. He answered, "Yes, because Ren is not taught, it is remembered. The heart already knows it only sleeps." He believed every human carried a spark of heaven's virtue. The task of the sage was not to create goodness, but to awaken it. He told his disciples, "When you see a man act cruelly, do not curse him. Ask instead, when did he forget himself?" One summer evening, Confucius and his students came across a farmer struggling to rescue a lamb trapped in mud. Without hesitation, the old master waded into the water, lifted the animal, and smiled as it kicked free. His robe was soaked, his hair clung to his face, but his laughter filled the valley. "The lamb does not know who saved it," he said, "but heaven does." The disciples never forgot that moment. It became the living image of Ren, compassion without calculation. Ren, he taught, was not confined by faith or nation. It belonged to no religion, no tribe, no dynasty. The man of Ren sees the foreigner as brother, the enemy as teacher, and the poor as mirror, he said. He believed that harmony among nations would come only when men saw each other as kin under heaven. "The sky," he wrote, "covers all without preference. Why should man do less?" In the quiet of his later years, Confucius returned often to his birthplace. The fields were smaller now, the people older. Yet when children greeted him, bowing clumsily, he felt hope. He told them stories, not of war or kings, but of kindness. A bird freed, a promise kept, a neighbor helped in silence. "These," he said, "are the songs heaven loves best." He understood now that Ren was not the voice of sages or rulers. It was the whisper that had always lived in ordinary hearts. Morning mist lingered over the courtyards of Lu. The first light of dawn fell upon the old roofs, where the sound of temple bells drifted between cypress trees. Confucius stood in silence before an altar, not in worship, but in gratitude. He bowed 3 times, each movement precise, deliberate, serene. His students watched quietly. When he straightened, he turned to them and said, "This is Li." Not the ceremony itself, but the reverence that gives the ceremony meaning. To Confucius, Ren was the soul of humanity, but Li was its body. Ren was love. Li was the art of expressing it. Without Li, love dissolved into chaos and virtue lost its voice. Compassion without discipline, he said, is a river without banks. It may overflow with good intention, yet it destroys what it seeks to nourish. Li was the invisible framework that allowed Ren to breathe, a code of conduct, a rhythm of respect, a bridge between emotion and harmony. He traced Li back to the ancient Zhou dynasty, where every action, from greeting a guest to burying the dead, was guided by ritual. But while others memorized these customs, Confucius sought their spirit. The ancients did not bow to please the gods, he explained. They bowed to remember humility. To him, Li was not superstition. It was discipline made beautiful, a daily rehearsal of harmony. One afternoon, his disciple Zilu asked, "Master, if Ren lives in the heart, why do we need rules at all?" Confucius smiled gently, because hearts forget. Ritual reminds. He picked up a teacup and held it between his palms. When I lift this cup slowly, I remember patience. When I share it, I remember generosity. When I set it down, I remember gratitude. Li is not for heaven's sake, but for ours. The students bowed, understanding at last that ritual was not restriction, it was remembrance. As Confucius walked through villages, he would often stop to watch ordinary gestures. A father serving rice to his son, a merchant offering thanks to a customer, a farmer wiping sweat before shaking another's hand. He saw Li in these small acts more than in grand ceremonies. If respect lives in the motion, he said, the world is already sacred. Li was the discipline of balance, knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to act, and when to yield. Confucius believed that etiquette was not vanity, but the choreography of virtue. He compared it to music. If each instrument plays as it wishes, there is noise. When each knows when to enter, when to pause, there is song. To live by Li was to move in tune with others. A life of measured grace, where even silence carried dignity. He taught that Li governed not only how one greeted a friend, but how one disagreed with an enemy. To speak with anger is easy, he said, but to correct with courtesy, that is Li. Once, when an official mocked him in public, Confucius simply bowed. When asked why, he replied, "He gave me rudeness. I return him form. It is not him I honor, but the order that keeps us human." This, he said, was the secret of Li, to answer chaos with composure. In his teachings, he divided Li into 3 realms: ritual of the body, gestures, posture, tone of speech. The way we move, he said, teaches before our words do. Ritual of society, roles and responsibilities between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, friend and friend. When each fulfills his part, he wrote, the world moves like a wheel. Ritual of the heart, the inward reverence that keeps the outer form sincere. Without heart, ritual is acting. Without ritual, heart is chaos. Together, these 3 made Li not a prison of manners, but an architecture of meaning. The scaffolding that allowed the soul to build upward. At dusk, he would often light incense and play the guqin. The music was simple, slow notes rising and fading into the air. When a disciple once asked why he played the same melody each night, Confucius said, "Because harmony is not found in novelty, but in constancy." Li teaches us that repetition is the mother of peace. He believed that beauty lay in continuity, that by repeating the same motions with awareness, one purified the self. A bow was never just a bow, it was a prayer disguised as politeness. Yet Confucius warned that ritual without Ren became emptiness. He saw nobles performing elaborate ceremonies while exploiting the poor, priests chanting with hearts full of pride. He said, "They wear robes of virtue but hearts of stone." That is not Li. It is theater. True Li, he insisted, must begin in sincerity. Better one honest bow than 1,000 hollow ones. He urged his disciples to make every act, however small, an act of intention. When you eat, be aware of gratitude. When you speak, be aware of tone. When you walk, be aware of those beside you. Every step, every breath, that is Li. Once during a journey, his group entered a village where no one observed manners. Children ran through temples. Elders were mocked in the streets. Confucius said nothing. Instead, he helped repair a broken shrine and swept its floor each morning. After several days, villagers began to greet him respectfully. By the week's end, they too had begun bowing before entering the temple. His disciples were astonished. "Master," they said, "you have changed them without a word." He smiled. They remembered what was never truly forgotten. That is the power of Li. In one of his later writings, he compared Li to the wind. When the ruler is virtuous, his virtue is the wind. The people are the grass. It bends in the direction the wind blows. To Confucius, etiquette was not oppression, but influence. A leader who moved with grace invited grace in others. Society did not need force, it needed example. He once said, "Command with punishment, and men obey out of fear. Lead with ritual, and they follow out of respect." But Li was not only for rulers, it was for every person who wished to keep peace within the boundaries of daily life. Confucius taught that even the smallest household could mirror the cosmos if its members practiced Li. When the son honors the father, heaven is at rest. When the friend keeps his word, the stars rejoice. He saw order not as hierarchy for power, but hierarchy for harmony, each part supporting the next, like strings in a lyre. There is an old story of Confucius at a wedding. When the groom entered carelessly, laughing too loudly, the master simply looked at him and said, "When joy forgets reverence, love loses its fragrance." The room fell silent. The groom bowed deeply and adjusted his robe. Confucius was not scolding. He was reminding them that even happiness requires balance. Li was not solemnity for its own sake, but the awareness that beauty lives in restraint. In his teachings, he linked Li with music, yue. He said that just as rhythm brings unity to sound, ritual brings unity to society. When music and Li move together, he told his disciples, the world dances without chaos. He envisioned an age when rulers would govern through harmony instead of law, when justice would be sung, not shouted. It was a dream others called impossible. Yet Confucius knew that every great symphony begins as silence. When he grew older, he looked back on his life and wrote, "At 15, I set my heart upon learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's will. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I followed my heart's desire without transgressing Li." Those lines would become immortal, describing the journey of a man who had turned discipline into freedom. For Confucius, Li was not constraint. It was mastery. It was the art of moving through life without disturbing its balance. In his final years, when asked what kept him at peace, he replied, "I live between Ren and Li, between the warmth of the heart and the structure of the world. The one makes me human, the other makes me whole." He believed that Li transformed daily life into a form of meditation, that every greeting, every bow, every shared meal could be an offering to harmony itself. Night had fallen over the state of Lu. The moon hung pale above the city walls, its light tracing the quiet streets where the poor slept under the eaves of shuttered mansions. From his window, Confucius watched a procession of carriages roll past. Nobles returning from a feast, their laughter echoing in the dark. In the alley below, a beggar searched through refuse for scraps. The contrast pierced him more sharply than any sword. "Li may teach us form," he whispered, "but only Yi gives it justice." Yi, righteousness, integrity, the moral backbone of humanity. If Ren was the warmth of the heart, and Li the discipline of the body, then Yi was the conscience, the compass that pointed true when the world spun astray. Without Yi, he told his disciples, virtue is theater. Without Yi, harmony is cowardice. Without Yi, even kindness can become corruption. He believed that harmony must never be blind, that peace bought with silence was not peace at all. To Confucius, Yi was the courage to choose truth over convenience, even when that choice demanded pain. The world around him tested this ideal daily, when officials bribed judges, when rulers betrayed promises, when scholars sold their wisdom for comfort. Confucius would sigh and say, "They have learned all the rules of Li, but none of the truth of Yi." He told his disciples, "Li keeps us balanced, but Yi tells us where to stand." One day, an ambitious minister invited Confucius to dine. The man spoke of loyalty and order, of how a state must sometimes use deception for stability. Confucius listened silently, then placed his chopsticks down and said, "Deception is a seed that grows into thorns. When truth bleeds for stability, both the state and the soul decay." The minister laughed uncomfortably, but Confucius only bowed and added, "A crooked ruler cannot build a straight kingdom." To Confucius, Yi was not about punishment or revenge. It was about clarity, the ability to see the right path even when it costs comfort. "When you act," he said, "ask not what brings gain, but what brings balance." He warned that morality measured by reward was not morality at all. "The gentleman," he wrote, "understands what is right. The petty man understands what is profitable." That line would later echo through dynasties, repeated by emperors and rebels alike, each claiming to stand on the side of Yi, though few ever lived it. One winter, while traveling through a neighboring state, Confucius and his students came upon a field of corpses, the aftermath of a battle between two rival lords. The snow was red in patches. Ravens circled overhead. His students covered their faces, but Confucius knelt among the dead, bowing 3 times. "They fought for their masters," he said softly, "but not for righteousness. A man who dies for pride leaves only sorrow. A man who dies for Yi leaves light." He picked up a broken arrow and turned it between his fingers. Strength without Yi is destruction. Only the righteous blade cuts clean. As he continued his travels, the doctrine of Yi became his torch. He refused gifts from rulers whose wealth was stained by greed. He declined honors that compromised integrity. When a duke offered him gold for advice, he accepted only food for his disciples. "Gold blinds," he said, "but truth feeds forever." He was mocked for it, called stubborn, impractical, even foolish. Yet his calm never wavered. "The foolishness of virtue," he replied, "is wiser than the cleverness of corruption." Confucius believed Yi was not learned from books, but awakened through practice. He once told his disciples, "When your heart hesitates, choose what you would respect tomorrow." For him, righteousness was not abstract law, it was the dialogue between conscience and action. Each moment demanded its own honesty. Sometimes Yi meant speaking truth to power. Sometimes it meant holding silence to protect another's dignity. The challenge was knowing the difference. And that, he said, was the lifelong study of the sage. One evening, his student Zigong asked, "Master, can a man be righteous and still fail?" Confucius looked up at the stars. "He may fail in the eyes of men," he said, "but not in the eyes of heaven. Success is the reward of skill. Righteousness is the reward of the soul. He added, To live without Yi is worse than death, for it is to breathe without honor. The words struck them all silent. In that silence, Yi became more than a lesson. It became a vow. In Confucius's mind, Yi united heaven and earth through moral gravity. He believed that every righteous act, however small, helped realign the universe toward balance. When one man stands upright, he said, 1,000 others remember their spine. He compared Yi to a mountain. The mountain does not move for wind or rain. So should the men of Yi remain unmoved by praise or blame. This image, the unmoving mountain, became the emblem of his moral vision. To be righteous was not to be unkind, but to be steady, to bend only toward truth. But Yi was not always gentle. There were times when righteousness demanded resistance, when harmony itself had to be disrupted to be preserved. Confucius knew this paradox well. He told his students, when the ruler is corrupt and the people silent, rebellion of conscience is loyalty to heaven. He never called for violence, but he believed that silence before injustice was complicity. Do not mistake peace for goodness, he said. Sometimes the storm is the healer. During one of his journeys, he encountered a small town where the local magistrate had executed a farmer for refusing to pay an illegal tax. Confucius demanded an audience. When the magistrate mocked him, he said calmly, "You have taken a life for silver. Heaven will take your peace for the same price." The magistrate laughed, but a year later, he was overthrown by his own guards. When Confucius heard the news, he simply said, "Yi restores itself, even when men forget it." For Confucius, Yi was not measured by victory, but by intention. He taught that one could lose battles, yet still preserve the way. The true gentleman, he said, may walk alone, but he never walks crooked. He told the story of a fisherman who released a golden carp back into the river, saying, "Its beauty belongs to the water, not my pot." Confucius wrote, "That man knows Yi better than the princes who quote my words." He saw righteousness in simplicity, in honest work, in the refusal to harm even when gain beckoned. As Confucius aged, Yi became his inner compass. When asked how a man could recognize righteousness, he answered, "By the peace that follows his decision. If your heart trembles, it was not Yi." He warned against self-deception, the temptation to justify desire as virtue. The hardest war, he said, is fought within the conscience. Only the man who wins there may teach peace to others. To live with Yi was to live transparently, like clear water reflecting both heaven and earth. One spring morning, while resting near a monastery, he watched monks debating the laws of heaven. They argued for hours over definitions of virtue and sin. Finally, Confucius stood and said, "Righteousness is not in the mouth, but in the moment. The just man does not speak of morality, he becomes it." The monks bowed in silence. For once, the debate ended in peace. As his final years approached, Confucius began recording his reflections on Yi. He wrote, "The way is vast, yet the man of Yi walks it alone. His reward is not comfort, but clarity. His legacy is not fame, but the quiet courage of example." He knew his time was short, yet his faith in righteousness was eternal. He told his disciples, "If I die today, let my words remind the world. A kingdom built on fear will crumble, but one built on righteousness will outlive stone." The road to the capital of Lu wound through yellow fields and windswept villages. Confucius, now in his 50s, walked slowly, his disciples following behind. He had spent decades teaching farmers and travelers, kings and wanderers. Always the same message, that goodness must guide power, not the other way around. Now at last, he had been summoned to court. The Duke of Lu had heard of the sage whose words could still the greed of merchants. and soften the pride of soldiers. He hoped this man might restore dignity to a land exhausted by corruption. Confucius came not as a prophet, but as a servant of order, carrying with him nothing but his scrolls, his students, and a faith in the possibility of harmony. When he first entered the palace, he bowed deeply. He saw luxury everywhere: gold-threaded banners, silk robes, dancers moving in perfect rhythm. But beneath the beauty, he sensed dissonance. The courtiers bowed to their ruler, but not to truth. Their smiles were polished, their hearts were elsewhere. That night, the Duke invited Confucius to a banquet. Musicians played, wine flowed. The Duke asked, "Master, how does one make a kingdom prosper?" Confucius answered gently, "By governing with virtue. When the ruler is just, the people are honest. When the ruler is greedy, the people steal. The wind bends the grass in the direction it blows." The Duke smiled and raised his cup. "A beautiful saying," he said, "but the world is not built on sayings." Confucius replied, "Nor is it saved by swords." The hall fell silent. In the months that followed, the sage was appointed Minister of Justice. He worked tirelessly, simplifying laws, reducing punishments, freeing those imprisoned for poverty rather than crime. He met the accused personally, listening to their stories before passing judgment. His fairness astonished the people. For the first time in years, thieves returned stolen goods voluntarily, ashamed before a man who treated them with dignity. He told his aides, "Punishment may stop crime, but only righteousness stops desire." Under his brief administration, Lu grew peaceful. Trade flourished. Families ate together without fear. The streets echoed with music again. People began calling the period the season of virtue. Yet peace built on integrity always threatens those who profit from chaos. Other ministers envied his influence. Foreign rulers feared that a virtuous Lu would shame their own corrupt courts. And within the palace, whispers began to twist his name. "He seeks power through virtue," they said. "He wants to make himself king in spirit, if not in title." Confucius heard these rumors and sighed. When the world loves profit, even honesty becomes rebellion. Still, he refused to change his ways. He believed that a single righteous court could light all of China. A lantern need not fill the sky," he said. "It only needs to be seen." One evening, as he returned from a council meeting, he found soldiers guarding the temple of his ancestors. Inside, noblemen from Xi, Lu's rival state, were feasting with the Duke, offering rare gifts, horses, silk, and dancers. Confucius watched from the shadows. He understood the message. Bribery dressed as diplomacy. The next morning, he approached the Duke and bowed. "My lord," he said softly, "if a ruler loves music more than morality, his kingdom will dance toward ruin." The Duke frowned. "These gifts are tokens of friendship." Confucius replied, "Then may your friendship never cost the people's hunger." Soon after, his reforms were quietly reversed. The prisons filled again. The merchants returned to cheating scales. Virtue had been too brief a guest. Disillusioned, Confucius resigned. His disciples begged him to stay, to fight from within, but he shook his head. When the strings are broken, the instrument cannot sing. He left Lu once more, walking into exile under a gray sky. Behind him, the city he had loved faded into mist. Ahead of him, endless roads stretched across a divided land. For the next 13 years, he wandered from state to state, seeking rulers willing to listen. In song, he spoke to generals about mercy. In way, he lectured ministers about honesty. In Chin, he advised peasants to educate their sons before they dreamed of wealth. But everywhere, he met the same response: polite applause, followed by indifference. "The world wants order," he wrote, "but fears the discipline of goodness." His disciples, weary and hungry, sometimes doubted him. "Master," they asked, "what if no ruler is worthy of your teaching?" Confucius smiled sadly. "Then we will build a kingdom in words, and let time become its throne." Despite hardship, he never grew bitter. Once, when trapped between warring armies without food for 7 days, his students wept in despair. Confucius picked up his lute and began to play. The melody was slow, almost weightless, drifting into the starving air. When he finished, he said, "If a man can still make music in hunger, the world has not yet defeated him." He called this faith the harmony of endurance, the belief that justice must be lived, not imposed. One spring, the Duke of Wei sought his counsel. The state was plagued by rebellion. The ruler feared assassination. Confucius advised him to disarm the nobles and restore trust among the poor. The Duke hesitated. "Would that not weaken me?" Confucius answered, "It would strengthen your people. And the strength of the people is the only fortress that never falls." The Duke turned away. "Virtue does not fill the treasury," he said. Confucius bowed. "Nor does greed fill the heart." He left the next day. As the years wore on, his journey became less political and more spiritual. He began to see that the dream of a just society could not be built by decree. It had to be cultivated like a field, generation by generation. "Laws may command the hand," he said, "but only virtue commands the heart." He envisioned a world where rulers ruled by example, not fear, where education replaced punishment, where music and ritual guided emotion more deeply than swords could ever suppress it. It was, he admitted, a dream too vast for one lifetime. But he no longer sought success, only continuity. "Heaven's work is slow," he told his students. "The bamboo grows an inch a day, yet in 100 years, it builds a forest." His disciples recorded his words, spreading them across the states. Some called him mad, others called him saint. But among the people, stories of his kindness multiplied. How he had fed orphans with his last coins, how he had bowed to a farmer before asking directions, how he had refused to speak ill even of those who betrayed him. He became a legend, not of power, but of patience. "The just man," he said, "builds not monuments, but examples." His idea of government by virtue, slowly took root. Even kings who ignored him began quoting his maxims to flatter the people. Ironically, the very world that rejected him began to echo his language. One night, near the end of his travels, Confucius camped by a river. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, flowing endlessly eastward. He said to Yan Hui, his closest disciple, "Do you see how the river moves? It does not hurry, yet it never ceases. That is how the way should govern, quietly, without forcing, yet never stopping." He added, "The world will one day understand, not through conquest, but through reflection." The two sat in silence, the water whispering between them. A conversation older than empires. When he finally returned to Lu, his beard white and his pace slower, he found that the people still remembered him. They greeted him with respect, though the rulers pretended not to notice. He no longer sought offices or titles. Instead, he devoted his last years to teaching and writing, distilling the dream that had guided his whole life into words that would outlive kingdoms. "The just society," he wrote, "is not built by law or force, but by conscience awakened in many hearts. When the ruler is virtuous, the court becomes a family. When the family is harmonious, the nation becomes home." He knew he might never see such a world, yet when a student asked if he regretted his struggles, he smiled. "Regret?" he said. "No. To walk toward light, even if it lies beyond reach, is still to walk the way." The wind over Lu carried the scent of autumn, dry leaves, distant smoke, and the quiet of the fields after harvest. Confucius sat alone beneath an apricot tree, its branches bare, its shadow long. He was 63 now. The voice that had once moved kings had grown softer. The face that once faced princes without fear now held a serenity born of surrender. He had spent his life preaching virtue to a world that preferred convenience, and yet he was not bitter. He would often tell his disciples, "To teach the world is to plant trees whose shade we may never sit under." He had walked through glory and disgrace, exile and honor, hunger and abundance, and through it all, one truth remained. The way is not outside us. It lives within. In his later years, Confucius no longer sought rulers. He turned instead toward the quiet labor of reflection, sorting through the decades of notes, poems, and sayings he had gathered. He would wake before dawn, light a single candle, and write by its trembling glow. His disciples often found him murmuring to himself, revising one phrase again and again. When they asked why he labored so over a single sentence, he said, "Because a crooked word can mislead for 1,000 years." He was not writing for fame. He was sculpting meaning, chipping away at confusion until only clarity remained. Outside his home, the seasons continued their slow procession. Children played, soldiers marched, rulers schemed, life unchanged. And yet, within him, everything had changed. The man who once dreamed of reforming nations now sought to reform perception itself. He began to teach not how to rule others, but how to govern the mind. When you lose power, he told his students, you discover the freedom to be true. He realized that exile had been his greatest teacher. The rejection of men had revealed the acceptance of heaven. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Confucius walked along the river. He stopped to watch the water shimmer with dying light. To his disciples, he said, "Do you see how the river reflects the sky, even as it flows away? So should the man of virtue reflect heaven, even as the world changes around him." He paused, eyes half closed. The water does not complain that it cannot climb the mountain. It finds another way. Perhaps that too is harmony. In that moment, they realized the sage had turned his gaze entirely inward. He no longer sought to shape the world, only to understand its nature. During those years, his small household became a refuge for wandering scholars and weary travelers. They came seeking answers and found instead questions. Confucius greeted each one the same way, with a bow, a smile, and silence before speech. "When a man has spoken too much," he said, "even truth grows tired." He would pour tea, listen, and respond with stories instead of advice. To the warrior who sought victory, he told of water wearing down stone. To the poet who feared obscurity, he spoke of flowers blooming unseen. To the ruler who envied immortals, he said, "The just man does not need eternity. His echo will suffice." But even a sage cannot escape sorrow. In his 66th year, death came to his dearest disciple, Yan Huai, the student he loved as a son. The boy had fallen ill, worn down by poverty and travel. When Confucius arrived at his bedside, it was too late. He sat for a long time beside the still body, his hand resting on Yan Hui's shoulder, as though he could call him back with touch alone. The disciples waited in silence. At last, Confucius spoke. "Heaven is unkind to me. I have lost one who never spoke without thought, never acted without heart." He ordered no grand funeral, only a simple mound of earth and a carved stone that read, "Here lies one who understood before being taught." For days after, Confucius wandered the fields alone. When his students begged him to eat, he replied, "How can I eat when virtue has left my table?" Yet, in time, even this grief softened into wisdom. He said later, "When we lose what we love, we learn the depth of Ren. Grief, too, is a teacher." As his body weakened, his clarity deepened. He began to see patterns that had once escaped him. how joy and sorrow, success and loss, all belong to the same circle. He told his followers, "A man who knows heaven does not curse storms. He knows they cleanse what calm cannot." He looked back on the wars, the betrayals, the years of wandering, and thanked them all. "If the world had listened," he said softly, "I might have remained shallow. But the world's deafness made my heart listen deeper." His disciples recorded those words in trembling hands. One night, he dreamed of the old kings of Zhou, noble figures from the past whose virtues had once ruled the land. In the dreams, they bowed to him and said, "Your work is not in vain. What you planted will bloom after 100 generations." He woke with tears in his eyes. "Even dreams," he murmured, "carry the voice of heaven." From that night on, he ceased to worry about legacy. He taught as though the world were already whole, as though harmony were not a goal, but a hidden truth waiting to be seen. He called his final lessons the mirror within. Each morning, he urged his students to look into water before speaking, to see their own reflection and ask, "Does my face carry peace?" "Before you move mountains," he said, "smooth your own reflection." He explained that the greatest revolution was not political, but personal, that every act of honesty, every gesture of compassion, every moment of restraint was a small turning of the cosmic wheel. "When one heart becomes clear," he said, "the world brightens by a breath. That is how heaven restores itself, not in thunder, but in whispers." Despite his failing health, he never stopped teaching. On cold nights, he wrapped himself in a thin cloak and spoke by candlelight until his voice broke. His disciples begged him to rest. He smiled. When a man walks the way, every breath is his rest. They would find him at dawn sitting by the door, watching the sunrise with eyes that seemed to see both the beginning and the end. "The sun rises," he said, "not because it is commanded, but because it is faithful. So too must the man of virtue rise, whether the world welcomes him or not." In the quiet of his old age, Confucius returned to the music of his youth. He played the guqin again, its strings worn and faint, but still pure. When asked what melody he played, he answered, "The song of harmony, unfinished, yet eternal." He would close his eyes and lose himself in sound, each note a prayer for a world that might one day awaken. Those who listened said that the music carried both sorrow and peace, like two rivers meeting at twilight. On his 70th birthday, his disciples gathered around him. They expected words of celebration. Instead, he said quietly, "At 15, I sought learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's will. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I follow my heart's desire without transgressing the way." Then he smiled, a small, weary smile. "Now I understand that harmony is not something we build, but something we remember." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, a sound like distant applause. In his final months, Confucius often spoke to the wind as if it were an old friend. His disciples would hear him murmuring, "The way has no owner. It travels where it is needed." They feared losing him, but he comforted them. "Do not mourn me. A teacher does not die. His words keep walking." He left them with a final teaching. The way is simple: to see clearly, act kindly, and remain steady, even when no one sees. When Confucius's breathing faded into the morning wind, the world did not tremble. No armies marched, no bells rang. The sun rose as it always had, spilling gold across the humble house where the sage had slept for the last time. His disciples sat around his body, silent. Outside, the apricot tree shivered. Its petals fell like pale snow. Yan Hui was gone. Zigong wept. Zilu stared at the floor. No one spoke. Then, slowly, Zigong whispered, "The master is gone, but his words remain. We must carry them as he carried us." And so began the long echo, the age when memory became scripture. They buried him on a small hill by the river sea. No marble, no gold, only a mound of earth and a single stone carved with the characters Yongni Jimu, the resting place of Zhongni. Villagers came and placed reeds by the grave. Farmers bowed. Children left wildflowers. None of them had read his books, yet they felt his gentleness lingering in the air. He treated the small as if they mattered, an old woman said. That is why the great will remember him. The disciples built a hut nearby and stayed for 3 years in mourning, as tradition required. But even after the 3rd year, none could leave. If heaven could hear him, Zilu said, then perhaps heaven will hear us if we keep speaking. So they taught, to merchants, to farmers, to children who had never seen the master's face. In the years that followed, the small circle of pupils spread like seeds on wind. Each carried a fragment of his voice. Zilu taught courage. Zigong taught diplomacy. Xixia taught literature. Sengzi taught moral reflection. Wherever they went, they recited the sayings they had once heard by candlelight, shaping them into lessons. Villagers began to memorize them. Scribes began to write them. Before long, the scattered notes of Confucius became the Analects, Lunyu, selected conversations. Its opening line would later be whispered in 1,000 classrooms. Is it not a joy to learn and to practice what one has learned? Each phrase carried not the authority of a god, but the warmth of a teacher. That was its power, approachable, human, endearing. But the road to immortality was not paved in reverence alone. The disciples argued over interpretation. Some idolized the master. Others sought to preserve his humility. Sengzi warned them, if we turn the way into a shrine, we will lose the way. So they built no temples at first, only schools. Mud walls, bamboo roofs, rough benches. Inside, they taught children to read, to bow, to listen, to question. They repeated the master's golden chain of virtue. Ren, Li, Yi, compassion, discipline, righteousness, and then added a fourth, Shin, faithfulness. For without trust, said Zhengzi, even wisdom decays. Thus the pattern of Confucian learning was born. Study, reflect, act, and embody. As decades passed, war once again swept across the states. Dynasties rose and fell, but the saying survived. A wandering scholar could still walk into a burned village and find, among the ashes, a child reciting, "The superior man is calm and steadfast. The petty man is anxious and impatient." Even in ruins, his words offered structure, a way to remain human when the world forgot how. A century later, during the Han, an emperor named Wu discovered the ancient texts. He was young, ambitious, hungry for stability. His advisors told him of the sage who had once dreamed of a kingdom ruled by virtue. The emperor listened and said, "Let this man rule again, through the hearts of my officials." He ordered the Confucian classics to be studied in every school and inscribed on stone tablets so they could never burn. Scholars debated for days over every word. From that time forward, to enter government, one had to master the wisdom of the master. The dream of a just society, once ignored by princes, had finally reached the throne, not through conquest, but through teaching. Confucius, the man who had died in obscurity, had become the invisible emperor of moral thought. Yet, not all who quoted him understood him. Many wielded his words to justify obedience, twisting harmony into submission. They forgot that he had once defied tyrants. They praised decorum, but forgot compassion. Even the disciples of disciples could feel the distance growing. One night, An old scholar named Dong Zhongshu wrote by lamplight, "The master spoke of balance, not chains. We must read his heart, not merely his law." Thus began the first reform of Confucianism, a return to spirit over structure. Like tides, every generation reinterpreted the way, keeping it alive through renewal. By the Tang dynasty, poets carried Confucius's voice into verse. Du Fu wrote, "Though the house of the sage is silent, his words light 10,000 lamps." By the song, philosophers like Zhu Xi reassembled the classics into the four books, merging the master's moral code with the poetry of the Tao and the precision of reason. They built academies on mountain slopes where scholars debated not how to rule, but how to purify the heart. Each claimed to rediscover the essence of the old man from Lu, not through worship, but through introspection. To study the master, Zhu Xi said, is to polish the mirror of one's mind until heaven can see itself again. And so, through reflection, the man who once walked barefoot through chaos continued to walk through centuries. The way crossed oceans. In Korea, he became the root of civil law. In Japan, a guide for samurai ethics. In Vietnam, the backbone of education. In distant Europe, Jesuit scholars carried his words to thinkers who would call him the Chinese Socrates. Voltaire praised his reason. Leibniz admired his harmony. Even in lands that had never seen the apricot blossoms of Lu, people began to whisper his insight. Do not impose on others what you would not have them impose on you. The bridge between East and West had been laid by a teacher who never left his province. Yet, for all the temples, statues, and schools, the truest monument remained the same, the living act of learning. Every time a child bowed before a teacher, every time a ruler consulted his conscience before issuing a decree, every time a person forgave when vengeance seemed easier, the master's breath stirred again. The teacher is not dead, wrote a Han scholar. He has simply changed shape, from man to mirror. Centuries turned, empires fell, but each time civilization fractured, people returned to the same well. The Analects, the image of the man who walked with humility and taught with patience. His followers preserved not the perfection of a saint, but the persistence of a seeker. He had once said, "The wise man is not flawless, he is faithful." And so they were faithful to the idea that goodness, once spoken, never dies. As the story widens, the film shifts. We see classrooms lit by paper lamps in ancient Chang'an, monks copying characters by moonlight, children reciting lessons under trees. The camera pans over centuries, from scroll to printing block to book to glowing screen. The same words passing through countless hands. The narration continues. Every age has its noise, its arrogance, its forgetting. But across the millennia, the whisper endures. Be kind, be measured, be righteous. The world's shape may change, but the heart of harmony does not. In one imagined scene, the spirit of the master walks through modern streets, among towers of glass, neon lights, and restless crowds. He pauses beside a traffic signal where strangers brush past without looking. A child drops her toy. A stranger kneels to pick it up. The master smiles. "Still," he murmurs, "Ren lives." He watches a man offer his seat on a train, a woman comfort another in silence, an old worker sweep the pavement before dawn. Lee endures. He sees a protester hold a sign that says truth. Yai remains. He turns to the camera, almost smiling. The dream continues, not in temples, but in the daily decency of ordinary souls. The centuries flowed like rivers joining a single sea. Empires rose and broke like waves, but one current endured. A quiet philosophy born in a dusty classroom of Lu. Where swords had failed, words endured. Where rulers had forgotten, the people remembered. Confucius had dreamed not of eternity, yet eternity claimed him. His harmony became a grammar of living, a language by which generations learned to measure their hearts. The political legacy. When the Han Dynasty made his teachings the spine of statecraft, China discovered a new form of power: virtue as governance. Courtiers memorized his Analects. Ministers quoted him before decrees. To serve meant not to conquer, but to cultivate. To rule by moral force, the text declared, is like the North Star. It stays still, and all the stars revolve around it. For centuries, this became the ideal of administration. Civil exams replaced birthright with scholarship. A farmer's son could rise to office if he could read the wisdom of the sage. Thus, Confucius quietly rewrote destiny itself. Merit became the new nobility. It was imperfect, often corrupted, yet revolutionary. Power justified not by lineage or sword, but by learning and virtue. The social legacy. Beyond courts and edicts, his vision seeped into the grain of daily life. Families greeted the morning with bows. Children cared for aging parents. Neighbors settled disputes with patience. Across villages and dynasties, people learned to see order not as tyranny, but as cooperation, a choreography of empathy. Let there be decorum in the home, the master had said, and righteousness will rule the state. This linkage, from family to empire, became the moral backbone of East Asia. It taught that harmony begins small, in tone of voice, in gratitude, in restraint. It whispered that civilization is not built on walls, but on attitudes. The cultural legacy. In art, his ideals found color and sound. Painters showed balance through empty space. Poets praised moderation more than glory. The brushstroke itself became moral. Strength tempered by grace. Musicians sought harmony, not domination of melody. Even architecture bowed to his symmetry. Courtyards aligned to cardinal directions, each room a dialogue between heaven and earth. To live well meant to dwell harmoniously. Beauty, he once said, is the meeting of rightness and peace. His thought became aesthetic, turning ethics into art. The philosophical legacy. As centuries deepened, new schools of thought challenged him, legalists with their iron codes, Taoists with their fluid mystery, Buddhists arriving from distant India preaching compassion beyond identity. Yet, instead of fading, Confucius absorbed and rebalanced them. Scholars blended his moral rigor with Taoist humility and Buddhist mercy, creating a triad that would shape Asian civilization. The Tao gives shape to heaven, one monk wrote, but the master gives shape to men. Through synthesis, his teaching became more than philosophy. It became a culture of conscience. The moral legacy. Every civilization faces its question: how should we live together? For the West, the answer often lay in law and faith. For the East, it lay in harmony. Confucius had replaced commandments with relationships. He taught that virtue was not a list, but a rhythm, a way of tuning oneself to others until conflict became music. He did not demand perfection. He demanded awareness. The noble man, he said, is not a vessel. He adapts. Thus, morality ceased to be punishment and became performance, a lifelong practice, a mindful art of empathy. The spiritual legacy. Though he never spoke of gods, Confucius offered something profoundly sacred: the divinity of sincerity. He saw heaven not as a distant monarch, but as the moral resonance within all things. Heaven does not speak, he wrote, yet its silence commands the seasons. To live virtuously was to live in tune with that silent rhythm. Prayers became actions, worship became integrity. The temple was not built of stone, but of conduct. A bowed head, a gentle word, a promise kept. These were his sacraments. Centuries later, his temples would rise anyway, but their incense carried not petition, only gratitude. The intellectual legacy Confucius had also transformed the meaning of learning. For the ancients, knowledge was secret power. For him, it was shared awakening. To study and not think is blindness. To think and not study is peril. He turned education into ethics, knowledge tied to character. From his view of study came the scholar as moral ideal, a man or woman who reads not for rank, but for refinement. It became an identity that endured long after emperors fell. The teacher, the reader, the civil mind as hero. The global legacy. The 19th and 20th centuries brought storms again. Invasions, revolutions, ideologies that mocked the old ways. Many declared Confucius obsolete, a relic of feudal obedience. Temples were closed, statues torn down, but even then, his ideas lived quietly. In family meals, in teachers' patience, in proverbs whispered to children. And when the smoke cleared, the world found his voice again, newly resonant. In an age of machines, he spoke of humanity. In an age of speed, he spoke of patience. In an age of isolation, he spoke of relationship. Universities reopened the classics. Philosophers from Europe to Africa quoted him in new languages. His words entered digital screens, translated yet unchanged. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Confucius had become not merely Chinese, but universal, a citizen of conscience for all of humankind. The personal legacy. What remains of a life once lived in dust and silence? Not temples, not titles, but gestures. Every time someone bows an apology, offers tea before debate, forgives before demanded, he is there. Every time a leader pauses to ask, "Is it right?" instead of, "Is it useful?" he breathes again. To be humane, he said, is to be eternal. His immortality was not mystical, it was behavioral. The way did not promise salvation after death. It promised dignity in life. In that sense, he gave humanity something rarer than hope: responsibility. The invisible legacy. Perhaps his greatest gift was the idea that morality requires no miracles. It asks only mindfulness, the willingness to notice the small. A man closes a gate gently so it will not creak. A woman helps an elder cross a street. A child places the book back exactly where it belongs. None think of Confucius, yet all act by his rhythm. That, he would say, is harmony fulfilled. When goodness no longer calls attention to itself. As centuries merge into the present, the camera glides over modern cities. Trains glinting under neon, screens glowing in dark rooms, crowds crossing streets in quiet synchronization. A voice overlays softly. The legacy of Confucius is not a monument in stone, but the continuity of courtesy. His harmony is not utopia, but the art of staying human. Images of schoolrooms, boardrooms, families at dinner, a scientist bowing before elders, an artist rinsing his brush, ordinary harmony in motion. Then, a return to the old river where he once taught. Now it runs beneath bridges of steel, but the water still murmurs the same song. A narrator whispers, "The way never ended. It simply changed its clothing." The camera finds a teacher closing her classroom door at dusk. On the board behind her, a single line of chalk. Exile and Ren, the benevolent find peace and benevolence, the wise in wisdom. The light fades, the chalk remains glowing faintly, an ember of thought across 2.5 millennia. As part 12 draws to its close, the screen fills with faces: scholars, farmers, students, monks, ancient and modern, all bowing slightly toward one another. Their motion forms a circle, like ripples meeting in still water. Confucius's voice returns, blended from ancient Chinese and modern English. Harmony is not the end of difference. It is the conversation that difference makes possible. The circle dissolves into dawn light rising over the mountains of Shandong. The river gleams, endless, fade to black. 2.5 millennia after the sage of Lu walked dusty roads, his world seems distant beyond measure. We live among screens instead of scrolls, algorithms instead of ancestors, and the hum of machines has replaced the sound of wind through bamboo. Yet, the questions he asks still breathe beneath our modern skin. How do we live together? How do we balance freedom and responsibility? How do we stay human in the age of noise? And in each question, an echo answers: Ren, Li, Yi, compassion, discipline, righteousness, still relevant, still hard. The new noise, our cities never sleep. Light bleeds from windows through the night. Traffic flows like electric blood. People speak through glass and code, their words compressed into pixels. We scroll endlessly, knowing everything, feeling little. Confucius once warned, "The man who learns without reflection is lost. The man who reflects without learning is in danger." If he stood today in a crowded subway, he might see our faces glowing from phones and say, "We have learning without reflection again." He would not curse technology. He would ask for balance. To study the infinite is good, he'd say, if one still remembers the finite. The breath, the neighbor, the moment. Digital rituals? In the ancient courts of Lu, rituals kept chaos at bay. Today, our rituals are digital. Morning notifications, midday scrolls, evening feeds. They structure our time, but rarely our soul. Confucius might smile and say, Li still exists, but it has lost its heart. He would urge us to turn these motions into meaning, to message with kindness instead of impulse, to comment as if speaking to a friend face to face, to pause before posting as one would bow before speaking in court. Digital Li, not restraint by fear of judgment, but discipline born of respect. Ren in an age of anxiety. Confucius lived in chaos. We live in information, another form of chaos. We are connected to thousands, yet lonelier than ever. He taught that Ren begins in recognition, to see oneself in another. Imagine him watching a modern street. A homeless man sleeps beside a store selling luxury phones. The master might whisper, "Ren is the bridge you build with your eyes before your hands." In a world measured by efficiency, he would call for empathy as resistance. Small daily acts of attention that restore the texture of humanity. Yi and the moral fog. Our time does not lack knowledge, it lacks clarity. We debate truth in echo chambers, choose morality by trend. Confucius would say, Yi is to choose the right when the crowd cheers the easy. Righteousness in his eyes was not dogma, but discernment. He would urge each person to become a mirror, not to reflect the loudest voice, but to clarify light from shadow. He would remind us that justice begins in the individual decision to stay honest when dishonesty pays better. The return of education. In Confucius's world, to learn was to become moral. In ours, education has become a currency of competition. He would ask, what is the use of knowledge that does not make you kind? He would not despise our science or machines. He would praise their brilliance, but warn that intelligence without integrity is a bright weapon. He would stand in a lecture hall and say, the purpose of learning is to understand heaven within man. Every teacher who still believes in character over grades keeps his spirit alive. Harmony and the Earth Confucius spoke of balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. Today, the balance has broken. The rivers he once watched run gray. The air he praised for silence now roars with engines. If he walked our planet today, he might not speak first of morality, but of ecology. When man forgets his place between heaven and earth, he'd say, he loses both. He would call for Ren toward the non-human, compassion for rivers, mountains, and creatures that cannot argue their worth. Harmony was never meant to end at the edge of human skin. The crisis of identity, Modern life tells us to be ourselves, yet few know what the self is. Confucius would smile at our paradox. The self, he might say, is not found in isolation, but in relation. He believed a person became real only through others, through family, friendship, service. In his eyes, individuality was not a fortress, but a bridge. Perhaps he would look at our crowded feeds and say, "You have 1,000 connections, but few relations." The ancient solution still stands. Cultivate depth over width, presence over presentation. The age of speed. Confucius walked slowly, spoke slowly, listened long. He would be alien in our time of instant answers, but perhaps that is why we need him. He would sit in a cafe surrounded by rushing people and say, "A heart that beats too fast forgets its rhythm." He would remind us that speed without direction is just motion. Harmony requires tempo. To pause is not to fall behind. It is to let the music breathe. The new rulers. Our emperors are now corporations, our courts, the internet. Power still tempts, just as it did in Lu. Confucius would advise leaders as he did then. Lead not by fear, but by example. The virtue of the ruler is the wind. The virtue of the people, the grass. The grass bends in the direction the wind blows. He would say to modern leaders, pay employees fairly, speak truthfully, admit error openly. These are the new forms of Ren, Li, and Yi. Harmony in the office is no less sacred than harmony in the temple. The silence within. In a world that fears silence, Confucius would prescribe it as medicine. He would urge each person to build a small temple of quiet inside the mind, a space where no advertisement, no anger, no algorithm can enter. There, he'd say, listen for the voice that is not heard but felt, the voice of heaven in your own conscience. Heaven does not speak, he once said, yet it guides all things. To hear it today requires turning off the world for a moment each day. Confucius and the future. What would the master think of artificial intelligence? Space travel? Genetic engineering? He would admire the brilliance and ask, does it serve humanity or replace it? He would not fear progress. He would fear emptiness disguised as achievement. To know is good, he'd say. To care is better. If machines could calculate 1,000,000 possibilities, he'd remind us that virtue still belongs to choice. Wisdom is not data. It is judgment with a heart. Harmony. Reimagined harmony in the modern world is not uniformity of thought, but coexistence of truths. The master would look at a globalized planet and smile. Finally, he might say, the family has met again. He would see that the task is the same as ever: to create unity without erasing difference, to build agreement without crushing debate. In a time when disagreement divides nations, his voice returns like a balm. The noble man seeks harmony, not uniformity. That single sentence, a 2,500-year-old antidote to modern polarization. A world without borders. Confucius's dream of order once belonged to one land. Now it belongs to all. His values, respect, honesty, kindness, have no citizenship. They travel easily across languages and time zones, as at home in New York, as in Khufu. He would rejoice to see students from every continent studying his Analects in many tongues, not as ancient dogma, but as living conversation. The way of the sage, he might say, was never mine alone. It belongs to whoever listens. The whisper of continuity. As the camera moves through modern streets, children in uniforms bowing to teachers, a crowd falling silent for a moment of respect, families lighting incense on New Year's Day, the narration softens. He taught that order begins in small courtesies, that goodness requires practice more than preaching, that harmony is not a miracle, but a habit. We see an elder hand guiding a child's pen as it traces the character Ren. Ren. The camera pulls back slowly as the child looks up and smiles. The word glows faintly on the page, like light remembering itself. The modern Confucius. Perhaps there is no need to imagine him returned. He is already here. In the teacher who refuses to give up on a difficult student, in the citizen who chooses honesty when lies pay better, in the parent who apologizes to a child, showing that respect is not hierarchy, but humility. Confucius does not stand above history. He walks through it quietly. He is everywhere the goodness takes form without announcement. Final reflection. The narration returns to its meditative pace. We once called him a teacher, but perhaps he was a mirror. When we look into him, we see what we might be. Footage shows oceans, cities, faces of every age. The voice continues. In the digital storm, his lamp still burns, small, steady, human. Not to resist modernity, but to humanize it. Not to erase the new, but to teach it how to care. The hills of Khufu are calm at dawn. Mist curls between cypress trees, drifting over the river that once mirrored the footsteps of a wandering teacher. A rooster crows, monks sweep the temple courtyard, and sunlight climbs slowly up the carved stone of his shrine. For 2,500 years, people have come here. Emperors and peasants, poets and pilgrims, not to worship, but to remember. They bow before a statue of a man who never sought worship, a man who once said, "I am not a sage, I am only a transmitter." And yet, through time's strange humor, the transmitter became the signal itself. What then is the measure of Confucius? He left no miracles, no conquest, no temple to himself. He claimed no prophecy, offered no salvation, and promised no paradise. He was simply a teacher, and somehow, that was enough to change the world. The master's greatness, wrote a later historian, was not that he reached heaven, but that he raised humanity 1 inch closer to it. His life was not a tale of triumph, but of endurance. He failed often, dismissed by courts, mocked by rulers, ignored by the masses. And yet, like bamboo in winter, he bent without breaking. Perhaps that is the first measure of the sage, resilience without resentment. He never claimed perfection. He claimed effort. In the Analects, when asked if he was virtuous, he laughed. "How could I dare claim virtue? I strive for it. Nothing more." He admitted to anger, doubt, loneliness. He scolded himself as harshly as he scolded kings. He wept for lost friends, feared death, and questioned heaven. That humility, not infallibility, was his genius. He turned weakness into wisdom. Proof that moral greatness can coexist with human fragility. To know what is right and not do it, he said, is cowardice. And he never stopped trying to be brave. To understand his measure, we must step beyond the myths carved in stone. He was not a symbol of rigid obedience, as some later claimed, nor a distant patriarch enthroned in incense. He was a man who knelt beside crying mothers and offered his last rice to strangers. He scolded corrupt officials and comforted orphans. He believed that to bow sincerely was holier than to pray hypocritically. He once told his students, "When you stand at the edge of the well, remember thirst. When you eat, remember hunger. When you rule, remember helplessness." That was his theology, empathy as divinity. Throughout history, each era remade him in its own image. The emperors of Han turned him into law. The poets of Tang turned him into melody. The scholars of song turned him into philosophy. The revolutionaries of the 20th century turned him into controversy. But beneath every reinvention, the same quiet man endures. The one who listened before speaking, who corrected without cruelty, who loved without need of reward. He remains strangely modern because he was never fully ancient. His wisdom was not bound by dynasty. It was human scale, portable, personal. The camera glides through Khufu's temple halls. Rows of carved pillars, sunlight falling across characters etched into stone. Ren, Li, Yi, Xin. The narrator's voice softens. These are not commandments. They are coordinates. They do not tell us what to believe, but where to stand. And perhaps that is the true measure of the sage. Not to provide answers, but directions. He never defined heaven, but he trusted it. Heaven has given me virtue, he once said. If it intends to destroy me, what can I do but obey? That faith was not blind. It was participatory. He saw heaven not as master, but as mirror, the moral pattern of the universe reflected in the moral pattern of the heart. To live rightly was to align oneself with that rhythm. Thus, his teaching transformed fate into responsibility. Heaven may set the sky, but man sets his own horizon. In one story, a student asked, "Master, do the spirits truly exist?" Confucius replied, "If we cannot yet serve the living, how can we serve the dead?" It was not disbelief. It was prioritization. He redirected humanity's gaze from heavenward longing to earthly duty. The sacred, he taught, begins with sincerity. To respect others is the beginning of reverence. He moved holiness from temple to table, from prayer to presence. That subtle revolution is still unfolding. As dynasties turned, his legacy was weighed and reweighed. Some accused him of taming passion, dulling creativity, serving power. Others defended him as civilization's conscience. Both were partly right. His teachings could be misused, as chains or as compass, depending on who held them. But that, too, was part of his measure. His ideas were vast enough to contain contradiction. A great river, a scholar wrote, carries both clear and muddy waters. Confucius's river still flows, sometimes pure, sometimes politicized, but always moving toward the same sea of moral reflection. And yet, even now, standing among his statues, one senses something beyond doctrine, a warmth, a humility, a silence that listens more than it speaks. He once said, "The wise man is quiet, the good man untroubled, the courageous man unafraid." In a world forever speaking, that quiet feels radical. It is the quiet of integrity, not indifference, but balance. He taught that to raise one's voice meaningfully, one must first learn to listen, to oneself, to others, to the still rhythm beneath chaos. That is the second measure of the sage, clarity without arrogance. Philosophers later asked whether Confucius was an optimist or a realist. He was both. He saw the cruelty of men and still believed in their potential. He watched kingdoms burn and still spoke of harmony. He knew that morality is fragile, yet worth rebuilding every dawn. The way, he said, is not far from us. And perhaps that was his greatest gift, proximity. He brought virtue down from the heavens and placed it in the heart, the home, the handshake. As the narration continues, the film shifts between times. A scholar copying the Analects by candlelight, a modern child reading the same lines on a tablet, a monk sweeping fallen leaves in silence. Each is the same gesture repeated across millennia, the act of remembering. He who remembers what is right, the voice says, walks with the master, even if the world forgets his name. And in that remembrance lies his truest immortality. He was not the strongest, but he endured longer than the conquerors. He was not the richest, but his words enriched more minds than gold. He was not the loudest, but his whisper has crossed 25 centuries. If greatness is measured not by domination, but by duration, then perhaps no man has been greater. To influence the living is achievement, a historian wrote. To influence the unborn, that is the work of eternity. By that measure, Confucius belongs to eternity. Still, he would have rejected such praise. If he could stand before us now, he would likely bow and say, "I am still learning." That humility is his final lesson, the third measure of the sage, wisdom without pride. To grow, even at the end. To listen, even when all listen to you. The night he passed, the wind in Lu fell still. A single candle burned beside his bed, its flame trembling but unextinguished. His disciples waited outside, not daring to speak. When dawn came, the light that had filled their lives flickered once, then steadied into silence. No thunder marked the moment, no omen split the sky. Only the hush of a man who had said everything he needed to say. Sagong wrote later, "The master departed as he lived, without noise, leaving the world to listen to the echo. They buried him where the river bends, and the reeds sway like pages in the wind. For 3 years, the disciples stayed nearby, tending the grave, reciting his words to one another so they would not fade. When they finally left, each carried a handful of earth from his tomb and a sentence engraved in memory. From those fragments, civilization rebuilt its conscience. The river kept flowing. So did his thought. The afterglow of a life history remembers kings in marble and conquerors in steel, but remembers teachers in silence, a silence that survives noise. Confucius's voice was woven into law, language, and custom until no one could separate where he ended and society began. He became invisible, which is the highest form of presence. When words become habit, he once said, their author may rest. His grave remained humble, yet pilgrims came for centuries. Some sought wisdom, others forgiveness. Many simply came to stand where a good man once breathed. A Tang emperor bowed there and whispered, "You have governed longer than any of us." The birth of legend. Time transformed the teacher into myth. They said cranes guarded his tomb at night, that the river never froze near his resting place, that when unjust rulers rose, his spirit walked their dreams. None of these tales would have pleased him. He had warned against superstition. Respect the spirits, but keep them at a distance. Yet legend was inevitable. The human heart needs miracles to explain endurance. When a man's ideas survive for millennia, it is easier to call him divine than disciplined. But the miracle was always simpler. He cared, and he continued. The Tfilis classroom. I imagine now a classroom lit by sunlight through paper windows. A teacher writes the character Ren on a board. 1,000 miles away, another teacher does the same in chalk, and another in pixels on a glowing screen. Different ages, same gesture. Every time that brush moves, the old man of Lu stands again, quietly watching. His smile is small, the kind that says, "Good, continue." Because the true immortality of a teacher is repetition, not of worship, but of understanding. Beyond nation and faith. He belonged to no church, yet inspired temples, served no king, yet guided emperors, preached no deity, yet awakened reverence. He proved that morality can be sacred without being supernatural. Heaven, he said, is silent, so must man listen. That listening spread beyond China, to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and, centuries later, the West. Wherever humans asked how to live decently together, his answers whispered through translation. Cultivate yourself, respect others, seek harmony, not uniformity. In every tongue, the melody remained the same. The river of influence philosophers called him sage, politicians, model, skeptics, moral engineer. Yet each found what they needed because his ideas were not chains, but channels. They flowed around obstacles, filling new shapes without losing essence. Through Confucius, Asia built its grammar of courtesy, its sense of time as cycle, not line, its conviction that self-discipline is freedom, not limitation. Even the rebellions against him proved his vitality. To argue with Confucius is still to study him. a mirror for every age. Every generation remakes him. The scholars of Han saw him as architect of order. The humanists of song saw him as seeker of mind. The reformers of the 20th century rediscovered him as champion of reason. And, in our century, amid the glare of data and disconnection, we meet him again, not as relic, but as reminder. To see what is right and not do it is to lack courage. His voice fits every era that hesitates between comfort and conscience. When greed wears new faces, he returns as integrity. When fear divides, he returns as empathy. When pride deafens, he returns as silence. The human face of wisdom. Unlike saints cast in perfection, Confucius left his flaws exposed. He doubted, he erred, he wept. That humanity is why his lessons endure. He showed that virtue is not divine inheritance, but daily work. The man who moves a mountain, he said, begins by carrying small stones. In a century obsessed with instant change, that sentence feels revolutionary again. The mountain is still here. Greed, anger, ignorance. And still, somewhere, someone lifts the first stone. The eternal teacher. A teacher never dies. He disperses into the minds he shaped. Every student who passes kindness forward is an extension of his breath. Every book that teaches conscience is his continuation. Every moment we pause before speaking harshly, his hand rests gently on our shoulder. He once said, "When a good man teaches, he renews heaven." Then perhaps heaven renews itself every day. The quiet triumph. At the end of his life, he feared he had failed. He told his students, "No one understands me." But history did. The silence after his death was not rejection, but incubation. Like a seed buried too deep to see, his ideas germinated slowly, and centuries later burst into bloom. What he taught was simple, yet infinite. That goodness is practical, that respect is strength, that peace begins in behavior. No empire lasted as long, no sword cut as deeply, no temple reached as far as the manners he restored to mankind. Return to the river. The film returns once more to the river of Lu. Its current glows with evening light, reflecting clouds that drift as slowly as thought. The camera follows the water downstream, through villages, cities, oceans, until it merges with waves beneath modern skylines. The voice of the narrator, soft and reverent. The river that carried his reflection now carries ours. Its water changes, but its rhythm endures. So does his teaching, endlessly dissolving, endlessly returning. Closing reflection. A final montage. Students in classrooms, strangers helping each other, a teacher adjusting a child's collar, an old man closing a book of Analects, whispering the same words Confucius once spoke. Is it not a joy to learn and to practice what one has learned? The scene widens, the world glowing in the curve of dawn. The voice continues. He asked for no followers, only fellow learners. He promised no paradise, only the possibility of peace. He left us not commandments, but conversation. And in that conversation, humanity continues. The music swells, Guqin joined by full orchestra, ancient strings blending with modern harmonies. The camera tilts upward through the clouds, rising into a sky filled with floating lanterns. Each lantern bears a single word: Ren, Li, Yi, Shin, He, compassion, ritual, righteousness, faith, harmony. The lights drift higher, forming the shape of a constellation, a human figure walking calmly among the stars. The narrator whispers, "He walked once through dust, now he walks through memory." The road is endless, the lesson unfinished, and the teacher, eternal. Fade to white.